What is good, my friends? Good to see you all once again in yet another video. Today, we're going to show why Professor Stick needs to ask for his money back for his Ph.D. because the reasoning displayed in this video and his analysis on this fine gentleman named Alistair McGrath is at best on par with grade school, not college level school. We will start off by watching the first minute and some change for some starting context. And so, with that said, let's jump into the video and teach this quote-unquote professor a thing or two.
We got another video request, this time from Half-Eye. It's basically just Alistair McGrath explaining how science turned him away from atheism. It's a short video, so let's just power through it.
When I was studying sciences at high school, I loved science. I thought, this is really wonderful. I also felt, look, this thing called religion is just anti-rational, anti-scientific nonsense. I mean, who believe this kind of thing? I think when I went up to Oxford University to study science properly, I did chemistry as an undergraduate and then did research in molecular biophysics, I began to realize that things were much more complicated than that.
What do you mean much more complicated than that? What's more complicated, the science? You said you did research, so your job entitled you to discover things that we have yet to know. Did you realize that the knowledge is much more complicated? More complicated than what? And how would anything being complicated turn you into a theist? God, I have so many questions.
I think one of the things I began to realize was that by its very nature, science was unable to answer a whole range of questions about meaning and purpose and identity.
I'm sorry that you're disappointed by that, but science cannot answer those things for us. Science only deals with things we can prove. It involves gathering evidence to discover the reality of the universe. Things like meaning and purpose are not things that you can empirically prove or test, because by definition, those things are subjective, and science doesn't give a fuck about your feelings. I'm sorry that science wasn't enough for you, but to wander off and make shit up without any evidence or objectivity is not a good excuse to turn to theism.
Okay, now there are a number of different things I need to hit on here. To start, he's operating on the obvious assumption that science is necessarily objective, and such can be possibly further from the truth. The fact of the matter is there are things in science which are subject to our own assumptions. For example, this is how Professor William Lane Craig put it in his debate with Peter Atkins years ago.
And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
And so, far beyond simply claiming that science does not account for things like meaning and purpose, science also cannot account for science itself. Even if one argues science is objective, they cannot rationally deny there are often unprovable assumptions made in science itself. Therefore, there is no logical necessity science is free from subjectivity. When he says science can only deal with things we can prove, he is either ignorant or deliberately ignoring when science starts from things which haven't been proven itself. And so, he has no room to simply criticize the gentleman being unsatisfied about things science doesn't explain, yet doesn't equally criticize the use of science operating itself on things it hasn't explained. If he uses science at all, then he needs to be criticizing himself first before he criticizes anyone else about objectivity. And furthermore, how does he know that the man just made S up without evidence or objectivity to go to theism, as he put it? Does he know the guy? We are barely over a minute into the video, and the professor already starts off with an outrageous and flat-out stupid assumption he has provided absolutely no basis for.
I think I began to realize that although science was wonderful, it had its limits, and that I wanted to go beyond those limits. In fact, more than that.
Mr. quote-unquote professor here just grilled this man for no reason, saying that things like purpose aren't things which are accessible by science by definition. It appears he truly once believed things like meaning and purpose were truly explainable by science, yet came to understand the limits later on. It's like he's grilling the man as if he was supposed to have necessarily been aware from the beginning. Science does not, it cannot explain everything. We aren't even that far into this video, and I'm already sensing some massive arrogance and an outright irrational narrow-mindedness from Mr. Professor here. In my experience, and the experience of many other non-atheists I know, the vast majority of atheists they've spoken to portrayed the same or similar kind of arrogance and irrational narrow-mindedness. Atheists like this guy act like they cannot possibly entertain the possibility someone may have been originally legitimately ignorant in their approach to something. Not only is that uncalled for and unfair, but it is absolutely disrespectful and despicable. Let's give this guy a moment of silence for his stupidity. Thank you. And now, we return to our regularly scheduled programming.
I can see what you're saying. Oh, look, science can't tell us things that by their own very definition can't be objectively proven, so I'm going to turn to theism.
Notice how this shallow prick is insulting his accent when he says turn to theism. You, sir, already get another moment of silence for your outright not only stupid behavior, but for the fact it's already evident you are just an all-around terrible person who needs to be put in your place. Again, I thank you all, and we yet again return to schooling the professor.
Okay, look, if that really is the reason you're turning into a theist, then that's just ridiculous. Those questions you propose, the meaning and purpose of life, can be easily answered without turning into a theist. No, science cannot answer these subjective questions for you, so that's why you give yourself purpose and meaning. It may not be an absolute truth, but it can make yourself feel better. There are plenty of people who do that, plenty of people who are not religious but come up with their own purpose to life. You could easily have been one of those people, but instead you turned to theism. Both you and these people made up life purposes. The only difference is that they get it from themselves while you get it from others.
Saying that all questions can be easily answered without becoming a theist is just an assertion. Even as a Christian, I don't claim all questions about meaning and purpose simply have easy answers in Christianity. He is making an egregious assumption, thinking that Alistair was merely looking for easy answers in theism, and he simply has no way to verify that at all. And he piles on yet another assumption by generalizing both theists and atheists as if they all just simply make purposes for their lives, which he simply cannot prove that. I think it's time yet for another moment of... Never mind, we can never get through this video if we kept having to stop for a moment of silence for his outright stupidity. He's assuming way too many things about the man, and it's quite clear he doesn't even know the guy. This dude has shown in barely over 2 minutes into his video that his arguments are stacked with one assumption after another.
That if you're a human being, you are going to ask these deeper questions which science just can't answer unless it goes beyond its own natural and right limits.
The reason people tend to ask questions like that is due to curiosity, but also due to fear. A life without an objective purpose sounds frightening. The idea that there isn't a supreme being watching over us can be frightening. These questions humans ask are less about finding the truth to the world around us and more about escaping the truth. This is why an idea that can give us a delusion to escape this truth is very attractive, but just because it makes us feel better doesn't make it real.
Okay, first of all, people can go into or out of theism or atheism based on fear. Yes, it is true there are people who went into theism based on fear, but all the same is also true with atheism. There are many atheists who have claimed they used to be Christians who were indoctrinated with the fear of hell and felt like they were in a constant state of fear until they found atheism and thought it was rational, and over time atheism released them from that fear. Now, I don't accept for a second that genuine belief in Christianity is even motivated by fear. But even if I were to do so for the sake of argument, that would have absolutely nothing to do with whether Christianity is true or false. The origin of how somebody comes to believe something has no bearing on whether that belief in question is true or false. And to discount that based on origin solely is the genetic fallacy. And as a Christian, I can give a defense for why it's not rational for believers to be absorbed constantly with the fear of hell, because it's predicated on lack of faith in the blood of Jesus. But that's another video for another day. The point is simply that when he claims people go into theism based on fear and to find an escape from the truth, which he doesn't define what the truth is at all, it is just as much true people run into atheism based on fear also to find an escape as well. It's a two-way street. There can be the desire to escape a world without objective meaning, and such a desire may or may not be based on fear. There can also be the desire to escape a world without accountability to a higher being, which can send one to hell. Again, it works both ways, but he conveniently left out that little detail. And second, it's interesting, he just said because it can make us feel better doesn't make it real. But that also works for saying that feeling better about giving yourself purpose without turning to theism doesn't make it real either. He wants to sit up here and run his mouth about quote-unquote attractive delusions, yet out the other side of his mouth advocate for attractive delusions by inventing illusory subjective purposes in atheism. Just that fast, he undermines and undercuts his own argument.
And it seemed to me that either I had to say this is just nonsense, or there is something there which science can't get access to, and I need to discover this.
Objectively speaking, how would you even know that there's something beyond science? Science is a method, so you're essentially saying that there's potentially something that we can't discover with the scientific method. In that case, there's no reason to ever believe that something like that even exists. Science is the best method we have to discovering truth to the universe. Anything other than that cannot give reliable results, so if you're looking for something that science cannot give, then essentially you can't prove it's ever there to begin with. And even if you do know for certain that something beyond science exists, there's no reason to ever turn to theism as a method to discovering this truth, because there are like an infinite number of ways you could try to learn about reality. The fact that you chose religion only shows that this is propaganda rather than an honest discussion.
He says, objectively speaking, how would Alistair know there is something beyond science? But a similar question can be asked of him, that how would he know that science is necessarily the maximal extent of how truth is ascertained? He simply has no way to prove that at all. And it's interesting, he says that something which cannot be discovered by the scientific method are to be considered things which reasonably do not exist. But how on earth would he go about proving that claim? It's just another assertion. You being a quote-unquote professor, sir, need to listen to your own line of reasoning. Feelings do not make something real. And you simply feeling that something which cannot be discovered by the scientific method can reasonably said to not exist doesn't make that feeling real. Yet another unsubstantiated assertion is claiming that science is the best method we have to discovering truth in the universe. He is simply giving his personal opinion as if it's the gospel truth. And he makes it worse by saying there are an infinite number of ways to try to learn about reality if one could prove they could go beyond science. Yet somehow he has some magical insight to knowing one of those ways cannot be one specifically chooses theism, otherwise it's propaganda and not really an honest discussion. Yet again, just another personal opinion of his. He has no room to talk about propaganda when we are not even halfway into his video, and it's permeated with one stupid assumption after another.
And my initial assumption had been that atheism was just right and Christianity was simply wrong, superstition, nonsense. But as I began to look at Christianity more seriously...
Which begs the question, why did you choose Christianity instead of any other religion? I don't see Christianity being any more special.
This is worthy of a moment of silence for stupidity, but I'm not interested in taking too much time with the editing because at this point, I just want to be done with this other stupidity. I think the cricket noise just as well indicates my sentiments. He said, why did he specifically choose Christianity as if it's so special? How in the blue sky does he know the man didn't consider other views seriously? Just because he said he looked at Christianity more seriously does not necessarily imply he didn't consider other views more closely and seriously. He may have only mentioned Christianity, but that isn't a proof he literally only looked at Christianity. Yet another stupid assumption. If someone can do me a favor and count the number of assumptions this guy has made so far and post it in the comments,
that would be great.
he has zero room to talk about anyone begging a question when he's begging a question himself, assuming he only looked at Christianity. Furthermore, he apparently thinks theism in general is stupid, so let's assume for the sake of argument Alistair looked at some other theistic view specifically. Would it honestly matter to this so-called professor? Or could he possibly be more offended by Christianity than any other theistic belief? And this whole video of his is him preaching his personal propaganda.
I began to realize it gave me this way of looking at things. That's what theory is. It's a way of beholding, a way of seeing nature, which actually made far more sense than my atheism. And I eventually moved away from atheism and embraced Christianity.
What? How can atheism even be a method of obtaining knowledge? Atheism isn't even a claim. It's a negative. It's the null. But science can. Did you mean science? Because science and atheism aren't the same thing. And how reliable is the method that religion gives you? I'll give you a hint. Not reliable at all.
So now he drops an utterly stupid and common amateur atheist talking point by trying to define atheism as a thing which makes no claims, and while doing so contradicts himself. He says that atheism isn't a claim, it's the null. But earlier he said if something isn't discoverable by the scientific method, such a thing can be reasonably said to not exist. But something being reasonable to hold necessarily, at the very least, assumes a basic level of belief, which flies directly in the face of his null logic. And he runs his mouth all day about religion not being reliable at all, which is yet another assumption on his part. Yet he earlier talked about atheists can give themselves a purpose to make themselves feel better. But isn't that the very thing he was complaining about with religion, not being reliable at all? How does she show that an atheist arbitrarily giving themselves a purpose is reliable? The same criticisms he's throwing at religion, he isn't throwing at the atheists he's preaching to. This guy is a raving hypocrite.
And discovered to my delight, it gave me this way of looking at the world that made sense of science.
Why would it make sense of science? How in any way can religion make sense of science? Get that garbage out of here. I'm assuming you mean that the scientific discoveries make more sense to you if you think that an intelligent designer designed it that way. Well, I'm sorry, your inability to imagine a world in which nature itself can create its own phenomena and laws only says something about yourself, not science nor religion. Also, I would argue that it makes less sense. What intelligent designer would create a universe that is 99% uninhabitable? What intelligent designer would create such unnecessary and roundabout signaling pathways in cells? What intelligent designer would create all these diseases that we spend so much money on studying?
You know, the title of this video should be called, I'm a prick atheist. Listen to all my opinions like they are irrefutable truth. He tries to put words in Alistair's mouth by assuming Alistair meant talking about intelligent design instead of about what he actually said, how he believes religion makes sense of science. Put another tally on the board for yet another assumption. And in doing this, he outright attacked a straw man. The more I listen to this guy, the more he just sounds like he's trolling. Then he goes on a rant about how an intelligent designer supposedly did a bad job. Just more assertions and more opinions. Since intelligent design doesn't posit any specific design agent or agents, even if we were to say that something was badly designed, it doesn't equate necessarily to no design. At best, it would be a design that doesn't suit our quote-unquote professor friend here.
It gave me a motivation for studying science.
A motivation to studying science, huh? Well, that's interesting. Like, what? Motivation to discovering the things that God created? Let me tell you what I think about that. Obviously, any motivation for science is a good thing. The more scientists we have, the better. But my point of view is that science would be much more interesting without the assumption that a God created the universe. How interesting can it be to explore something which was created by someone? If we started with the assumption of an intelligent designer, then what we are doing is merely attempting to discover the properties and mechanisms put in place by someone, which has high predictability, not to mention a lot of narcissism. In this universe, we'd only be exploring things already known, stripping away the spontaneity of any potential research or discovery. Personally, Rationally speaking, a scenario like this would diminish my motivation for science. Suddenly it's not so interesting anymore. This assumption that the universe was intelligently created ruins the spirit I have for science. Now, of course, that's just me. You can get your motivation from wherever you want, and I'll consider it a positive thing. If you get into science because of your religion, then that's a great thing. What I said earlier only applies to myself.
Well, okay then. The professor is for once actually being honest. Now, if it only applies to him, then why is he sitting here whining about things like spontaneity being ruined for him? My answer, so what? He whines about predictability being taken out of the picture? My answer, so what? He whines about having a personal preference, a creator didn't do it? My answer, so what? Remember what you said, Professor. Feeling better about something doesn't make it real? Remember you said that? That means in this instance, you simply feeling better about the preference to a world without a creator doesn't make it real. It's not just this bit you mentioned right here that applies to you. Dang near this entire video only applies to yourself, as like 97% of it is you simply running your mouth about your own personal opinions, not actually giving any arguments. Many of the greatest scientific advances in years past were by scientists inspired by a belief in a higher deity. That is an indisputable history. You thinking that religion is a hindrance to science is yet again your personal opinion and nothing more.
But also opened up a much bigger vision of reality, which answered not simply cognitive questions about how the world functioned, but these deeper existential questions of what the world meant, what I meant.
That's a big reason why a lot of people stick to religion, because it makes them feel better. A life with an objective meaning is obviously better than a life without one, and I can understand. You have no idea. During the inception of my atheism, I literally begged that evidence would come up that proved the existence of a god, any god, because I wanted so badly for there to be an afterlife. However, as you can see, I'm an atheist. I couldn't just abandon my logical thinking. To me, knowing the truth is more important than being happy or hiding in the comfort of delusion. To be honest, being an atheist is lonely. It's not for anyone who's emotionally weak. Waking up every day can be a challenge knowing that this may be the only life you have and that there isn't anyone but yourself to look out for you. And yes, it is very scary, but I'd much rather live that life than to delude myself in something that isn't true. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic here. Sorry about that.
To be getting off topic at this point assumes you are on topic most of the time to begin with. But as I just said earlier, the vast majority of this video was the quote-unquote professor giving his personal opinion, not any logical arguments. And again, as I said earlier, it's a two-way street. Many people have ran to atheism hoping they find their escape from ultimately being held accountable and having to answer for the choices they made in this life. As one of the greatest mathematicians, John Lennox, rightly put it, paraphrasing of course, as atheists would claim theism, Christianity is for those afraid of the dark, atheism is for those who are afraid of the light. That light shining a spotlight on your personal depraved lifestyles. To ignore this concept cuts both ways is nothing short of foolishness.
It just seemed to me that really science and faith can come together in a meaningful way.
Yeah, no. Other than religion possibly giving you the motivation for science, these two things will never come together, because by definition, religion strays away from the scientific method. Keep them separate, please. Religion has no place in our quest to discover the mysteries of the universe. All it can do is hinder progress, because if you start with a conclusion and work backwards on the evidence like what creationists do, then we have a problem.
And the law of opinions and emotionalism continues. Absolutely pathetic.
Now, I know many would say, well, look, science answers all of our questions. Well, actually, it doesn't. It answers some questions very well, but there are huge areas, really important areas, where it cannot speak. So to speak, science, in effect, raises questions sometimes which transcends its ability to answer them.
It's true that science can raise a lot of questions while we are answering other ones. However, just because it can't answer everything doesn't mean you can get your answers from religion, because that will give you unreliable and unprovable results. Just learn to deal with the fact that we can't answer everything right now.
Or better yet, how about we posit this as an alternative? How about you just respect the fact that he wants to look for answers where he chooses? If you don't like where he looks, that's your problem, not his. If you want to simply have a conversation, whether he's being rational or not in his approach, then that's a fair conversation to have. But you've taken this ordeal beyond the scope and made this into a whole thing about your personal opinions, putting words in Alistair's mouth and even outright mocking his accent, arrogant prick behavior. Like I said earlier, dude, you're just an all-around terrible person and deserves to be put into your place where you belong.
And these are important questions that we need answers to.
Why do we need answers for those questions? To make us feel better? No thanks.
Again, I have to go back to what the professor said earlier about someone not having to turn to theism and giving themselves purpose to make them feel better. It's beyond stunning he seems to think such line of thought is only exclusive to deists. Almost everything terrible about a video you can imagine was in his response. To put the final nail on the coffin of Mr. Stick Figure, I'll end this video with one last moment of silence. That's it, my friends, and it would be my humble appreciation if you would share this video and others, rate, comment, and subscribe. Take care, God bless, and peace. Oh yes, and by the way, one last thing. This video was for you, Mr. Spark, so if you're watching this, this is a shout out to you, man.